They told me it was suicide to expel the French army. My generals warned me. Paris threatened me. Washington whispered that Africa was nothing without French protection. Even some of my own advisors pulled me aside and said, "President, you're playing with fire. No African leader survives a war with France." But 3 minutes ago, I signed the order. Every French troop in Burkina Faso is leaving. Not tomorrow, not next month, today. And Macron, he's stunned. His defense minister is scrambling. NATO headquarters is in emergency session. The Élysée Palace has been making frantic calls to Washington, demanding to know how this boy dared to challenge an empire that has controlled Africa for over a century. I answered them all with one document. Executive Order 2024-001, complete termination of French military presence in Burkina Faso, effective immediately. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is the story of how I declared independence from France's colonial army, not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent that's been waiting 64 years to finally be free. Do you want to know why this moment changes everything? Because for the first time since 1960, an African nation has told France, "We don't need your soldiers, we don't want your protection, and we definitely don't accept your control." Let me start with something they don't teach in French schools. For 64 years, French troops have been stationed across Africa not to protect us, but to protect French interests. They called it cooperation. We called it what it was, occupation with better uniforms. From Senegal to Chad, from Ivory Coast to Central African Republic, French military bases dotted our continent like colonial checkpoints. Over 5,000 soldiers scattered across 8 countries, all with one mission: ensure Africa never truly becomes independent. They told us these troops were here for our security, to fight terrorism, to maintain stability, but I grew up seeing the reality behind those lies. I grew up watching French convoys escort trucks filled with our uranium to ports we couldn't access. I saw villages without electricity while French companies powered Europe with our resources. I watched my people starve while French corporations exported our food to Paris supermarkets. This wasn't security. This was extraction protected by force. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. Keep African militaries weak and dependent. Station French troops as the real security force. Then use that military presence to guarantee French economic dominance. Any African leader who challenged this arrangement would face a simple choice: comply or be removed. They called it the France-Afrique system. We called it neo-colonialism with automatic weapons. But here's what they never understood about my generation of African leaders. We didn't grow up grateful for French protection. We grew up angry about French control. 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief handed me a classified report that made my blood boil. French troops weren't just stationed in Burkina Faso. They were actively coordinating with multinational corporations to secure mining concessions and resource extraction deals. Our own military intelligence had documented French soldiers providing security for foreign companies, while Burkinabe villages faced terrorist attacks with no protection. French priority wasn't our people's safety, it was corporate profit margins. The report contained satellite images of French positions. Every major base was strategically located near mineral deposits, not population centers. Communication intercepts revealed French commanders discussing economic security zones and resource protection protocols. But the document that broke my resolve was a memo from the French embassy to Paris. It read, "African leadership remains compliant. Military dependence ensures continued access to strategic resources. Recommend maintaining current troop levels to prevent sovereignty complications." Sovereignty complications. That's what they called African independence. That night, I sat alone in my office until dawn. Outside, Ouagadougou slept peacefully, unaware that their president was making the most dangerous decision in our nation's history. I asked myself a question that every African leader must eventually face. Do I want to be remembered as a caretaker of French interests, or as the man who finally gave Africa back her dignity? The answer came with the sunrise. I called my senior military commanders at 5 a.m. "Gentlemen," I said, "today we reclaim our sovereignty. Prepare operational orders for the complete withdrawal of French forces. No negotiations, no delays, no exceptions." General Traoré, my most trusted advisor, asked the question I knew was coming. "Mr. President, are you certain? France has toppled governments for less." "General," I replied, "France has controlled governments for more." Today, that ends. At exactly 11:47 a.m., I walked into the presidential conference room where the document waited. 1 page, 47 words. the most important sentence in Burkina Faso's modern history. By executive authority of the Republic of Burkina Faso, all French military personnel are hereby ordered to cease operations and depart national territory within 72 hours. No exceptions will be granted. My hand didn't tremble as I signed. This wasn't fear. This was freedom. The moment my pen lifted from the paper, history pivoted. The last African country hosting French troops by choice had just chosen differently. Within minutes, secure channels carried the news to the French embassy. Within an hour, Paris knew. Within 2 hours, the world was watching an African president do something no one thought possible: fire France. The French response was swift and predictable. Ambassador Laurent Delahousse demanded an emergency meeting to clarify this misunderstanding. I declined. There was nothing to clarify and nothing to misunderstand. Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu called personally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "President Traoré," he said, "this decision threatens regional stability and French-African cooperation." "Minister," I replied, "regional stability doesn't require foreign occupation, and cooperation isn't cooperation when only one side benefits." The call ended after 6 minutes. France wasn't used to African leaders hanging up on them, but the real explosion came from the Élysée Palace. Leaked transcripts from Macron's emergency cabinet meeting revealed the French president pounding the table, demanding answers. "How did we lose Burkina Faso in one morning? This boy is destroying decades of strategic positioning." Macron's foreign policy team scrambled to contain the damage. Emergency calls to Washington, Brussels, and other African capitals. Diplomatic pressure through international organizations. Threats disguised as concerns about regional security. French media went into overdrive. Headlines screamed about African ingratitude and dangerous populism. Opinion pieces warned of chaos without French protection. The same newspapers that had spent decades ignoring French exploitation suddenly cared deeply about African welfare. But something had changed across our continent. Young Africans don't get their news from French newspapers anymore. They saw through the propaganda immediately. While Paris panicked, African streets erupted in celebration. From Bamako to Niamey, from Dakar to N'Djamena, crowds gathered chanting my name and singing songs of independence. In Mali, President Assimi Goïta called me within hours. "Ibrahim," he said, "you've done what we've all wanted to do. Mali stands with Burkina Faso." Niger's leadership reached out through secure channels. "The French told us you'd collapsed without their protection," they said. "Instead, you look stronger than ever." By evening, demonstrations had spread across West Africa. University students organized rallies demanding their own governments follow Burkina Faso's example. Market women refused to buy French products. Youth organizations called for African solutions to African problems. The hashtag #France out of Africa trended in 12 countries. Social media exploded with videos of young Africans celebrating our decision. The viral moment wasn't my signing ceremony. It was a video of children in rural Burkina Faso cheering, "No more French soldiers! Africa for Africans!" Even in France's remaining African allies, cracks appeared. Senegalese opposition leaders demanded a referendum on French troop presence. Chadian civil society called for similar action. The dominoes were starting to fall. When military pressure failed, France deployed economic weapons. Within 48 hours, our access to French development funds was suspended for review. The World Bank announced concerns about political instability affecting loan approvals. The IMF suggested our decision showed concerning trends in governance. French companies began withdrawing from infrastructure projects. Diplomatic sources leaked warnings about Burkina Faso's increasingly isolated international position. European partners expressed deep concern about our unilateral actions. But I had prepared for this moment. For months, my economic team had been quietly diversifying our partnerships. Within a week of France's economic pressure, new opportunities materialized. China offered immediate infrastructure investment with no political conditions. Russia proposed security cooperation based on mutual respect, not dependency. Turkey, India, and Brazil reached out with partnership offers that treated us as equals, not colonies. The African Development Bank, led by African professionals, increased funding for our development projects. Fellow African nations opened trade corridors that bypassed French-controlled ports. Gulf states offered investment packages that dwarfed anything France had ever proposed. The message was clear. Africa didn't need French money. We needed African dignity. The geopolitical implications terrified Western capitals. If Burkina Faso could successfully expel French troops, Other African nations might follow. If France lost its military foothold in West Africa, its entire France-Afrique system would collapse. American officials privately expressed concern about Russian and Chinese influence in Africa. British diplomats warned about destabilizing precedents. German leaders called for measured responses to populist pressures. But the most revealing reaction came from African diplomatic circles. For the first time in decades, African ambassadors at the United Nations weren't apologizing for challenging Western interests. They were celebrating an African country finally acting like a sovereign nation. The African Union, usually cautious about confronting former colonial powers, issued a statement supporting member states' right to determine their own security arrangements. The Economic Community of West African States declared solidarity with Burkina Faso's sovereign decisions. Even South Africa, typically diplomatic in its language, called our action a legitimate expression of national sovereignty that deserves international respect. France found itself increasingly isolated, defending a colonial relationship that the rest of the world recognized as outdated and exploitative. French propaganda focused relentlessly on one theme. Without French troops, Burkina Faso would fall to terrorist groups. They painted apocalyptic scenarios of jihadi takeovers and regional chaos. Their message was simple: Africans couldn't protect themselves. This was their biggest lie and their greatest fear. The truth? French military presence hadn't eliminated terrorism in Burkina Faso. If anything, it had made the problem worse by creating dependency and resentment. Communities saw French soldiers protecting foreign mining operations while leaving villages defenseless against attacks. Our own military, hampered for years by French coordination requirements and joint operation protocols, was finally free to develop indigenous security solutions. Within weeks, we implemented community-based defense programs that French doctrine had forbidden. Local militias, trained by our own forces rather than foreign advisors, proved more effective at protecting their communities than any external army. They knew the terrain, spoke the languages, and had genuine stakes in local security. Regional cooperation with Mali and Niger, previously filtered through French command structures, became direct and immediate. African armies working together, sharing intelligence, and coordinating responses without European intermediaries. The results spoke for themselves. Security incidents in areas previously protected by French forces actually decreased after their departure. African solutions were proving more effective than colonial impositions. My decision triggered something unprecedented, a continental conversation about genuine independence. Across Africa, civil society organizations, youth movements, and political leaders began questioning their own relationships with former colonial powers. In Chad, student protests demanded the withdrawal of French troops stationed there since 2014. Senegalese opposition parties called for a referendum on continued French military presence. Even in Ivory Coast, France's most loyal African ally, voices began questioning the value of foreign military dependency. The conversation spread beyond Francophone Africa. Nigeria's leadership questioned British economic influence. Kenya's parliament debated ending military cooperation agreements with former colonial powers. Ghana's president spoke publicly about truly African security solutions. For the first time since independence, African countries were discussing continental unity, not as a distant dream, but as a practical necessity for genuine sovereignty. The African Continental Free Trade Area, previously blocked by European interference, gained new momentum as African leaders realized economic integration required political independence. Currency unions, independent of European control, became serious policy discussions rather than academic theories. France's worst nightmare was materializing. African countries were discovering they could succeed without European permission. My expulsion of French troops sent shockwaves far beyond Africa. In the Caribbean, former French colonies began questioning their own relationships with Paris. Pacific Island nations reconsidered military agreements with France. Even French territories like New Caledonia and French Polynesia watched with interest. The message resonated globally. Small nations could challenge great powers and survive. Latin American countries, long dominated by U.S. military influence, took note. Southeast Asian nations, pressured by Chinese expansion and Western intervention, saw a new model for asserting sovereignty. The global South was learning from Africa's example. China and Russia, eager to fill the vacuum left by French withdrawal, offered partnership models that emphasized mutual benefit rather than dependency. Their success in Burkina Faso would influence their approaches across the developing world. The United States, concerned about losing influence to rival powers, began reconsidering its own military footprint in Africa. The Pentagon quietly initiated reviews of American base agreements, recognizing that the colonial model was becoming unsustainable. Europe faced a choice: adapt to post-colonial realities or watch African nations choose alternative partners who offered genuine respect for sovereignty. This decision wasn't without personal risk. French intelligence had a long history of eliminating African leaders who challenged their interests. Sylvanus Olympio in Togo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. The list of African leaders who died after confronting France was long and bloody. I knew the dangers. My security detail was increased. Travel plans became classified. Close family members were quietly relocated for their protection. Every meal was tested, every vehicle inspected, every meeting carefully screened. French intelligence assets in Burkina Faso, cultivated over decades, suddenly became potential threats. Our counterintelligence services worked around the clock to identify and neutralize foreign operatives who might attempt to destabilize our government. International travel became complicated. French allies created security concerns about my presence at international summits. Diplomatic immunity was questioned. Airport security in European countries became unusually thorough. But the support from my people made every risk worthwhile. Villages that had never seen their president before invited me to celebrate our independence from French control. Children who had grown up under foreign military occupation now played freely in areas previously restricted by French security zones. The pride in their eyes, the dignity in their voices, the hope in their dreams, this was worth any personal danger. Today, 6 months after expelling French troops, Burkina Faso stands stronger than ever. Our economy has grown as we've redirected resources from foreign military support to domestic development. Our security situation has improved through community-based solutions and regional cooperation. International partnerships have expanded beyond anything we achieved under French tutelage. Chinese infrastructure investment has accelerated. Turkish development programs have multiplied. Indian technology transfers have increased. Brazilian agricultural cooperation has deepened. Most importantly, our people have rediscovered their dignity. Students study African history without European interpretation. Farmers grow crops for African markets rather than French export quotas. Miners extract resources for African development rather than European consumption. The French predicted chaos. Instead, we found freedom. Other African nations have taken notice. Mali announced the withdrawal of French forces shortly after our decision. Niger's leadership is reconsidering its military agreements with France. Chad's president faces growing pressure to assert similar independence. The dominoes continue to fall. France's African empire, built over a century of exploitation, is crumbling because one African leader finally said, "Enough." The lesson for other African leaders is simple. France needs us more than we need France. They require our resources, our markets, our strategic positions. We only require our dignity, our sovereignty, our right to self-determination. For too long, we accepted the myth that Africa couldn't survive without European guidance. That myth served European interests, not African development. The truth is the opposite. Europe cannot maintain its standard of living without African resources. When we demand fair partnerships instead of accepting colonial relationships, the entire dynamic changes. When we negotiate from strength rather than desperation, we achieve better outcomes. When we believe in our own capabilities rather than accepting external limitations, we discover untapped potential. The choice facing every African leader is clear: remain comfortable clients of foreign powers or become proud citizens of independent nations. Comfort is temporary, but dignity is eternal. This isn't anti-French sentiment or anti-Western prejudice. This is pro-African pragmatism. We welcome partnership with any nation that respects our sovereignty and treats us as equals. We reject any relationship based on dependency, exploitation, or the assumption that African consent is optional. France could have chosen partnership over domination. They could have offered cooperation instead of control. They could have treated African nations as allies rather than colonies. They chose otherwise, and now they're experiencing the consequences. The choice moving forward remains theirs, but understand that Africa's choice has already been made. We choose independence over dependency. We choose sovereignty over subjugation. We choose dignity over domination. To other global powers watching this transformation, Africa is open for business, but the business must be conducted between equals. The era of neo-colonial exploitation is ending. What replaces it depends on your willingness to adapt to African aspirations, rather than attempting to suppress them. To young Africans across the continent, this is your moment. The generation that accepts European control is passing away. The generation that demands African solutions is rising. Your continent has everything needed for prosperity: resources, population, talent, potential. The only thing missing was the courage to claim it. That courage is spreading, from Burkina Faso to the rest of Africa, from our villages to your cities, from my signature on a single document to your voices demanding change across the continent. 3 minutes ago, I signed an order expelling French troops, but today, I signed something more important: Africa's declaration of independence from the colonial mindset that has held us back for too long. This revolution isn't military, it's psychological. It's the moment when African leaders stop asking for permission and start demanding respect. It's when African people stop accepting exploitation and start expecting partnership. It's when the continent that built the pyramids, that gave the world mathematics and medicine, that survived slavery and colonialism, finally stands up and says, "We are not your children. We are your equals." The revolution will not be supervised by France. It will not be managed by former colonial powers. It will not be contained by Western interests. The revolution will be African by Africans, for Africa. And it has already begun. This is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is how we reclaimed our independence, not just from French troops, but from the colonial mindset that made those troops seem necessary. The future belongs to those brave enough to seize it. Africa's future belongs to Africans. France learned this lesson the hard way. Other powers can learn it the easy way, by choosing partnership over domination. But one way or another, they will learn it. The age of African colonialism, military, economic, or psychological, is ending. What comes next depends on how quickly the world adapts to that reality. Africa is not for sale. Africa is not for rent. Africa is not for control. Africa is for Africans, and that is non-negotiable.